Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our speaker series. What can the international relations field teach us about the contemporary world? My name is Federman Rodriguez. I serve as an associate professor and BA academic coordinator of the International Relations Program at the Universidad del Rosario, and I have been also on the editorial board on the Canadian Foreign Policy Journal after obtaining my PhD in political science at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. It's a real pleasure to moderate today's session. This series is meant for scholars, official students, and anyone who wants to better understand global affairs through a scholarly yet accessible point of view. Today, we are joined by two special guests. Mr. Daryl Davis, Commercial and Economic Counselor at the Embassy of Canada in Colombia, and our main speaker, Professor Stefano Tijerina, who will present his book Opportunism and Goodwill, Canadian Business Expansion in Colombia, 1867-1979. I also want to greet our audience, made up mostly of international relations students from the Universidad del Rosario and comparative politics students from the University of Maine. Let me introduce Counselor Davis. He has been in his current role since August 2022 as a career diplomat. This is actually his second posting in Colombia. He has also served at the Canadian embassies in Spain and Mexico, and in Canada, he has held several leadership positions within the Canadian Trade Commission Service. As my students of North American Studies must know, this is Canada's trade promotion organization. Our speaker, Professor Tijerina, holds a PhD in history from the University of Maine and is a senior lecturer at the Maine Business School. He has received several fellowships, including the P.D. Merrill Research Fellowship and the Chris Cobrat Research Fellowship, and has also been recognized as a North Star Collective Faculty Fellow and Provostial Fellow at the University of Maine. As we know today, his research looks at Canadian and US business expansion into Latin America. Even today's talk is about business history. It has clear relevance for international relations. Professor Tijerina's work helps us understand, for example, the links between trade and foreign policy, the relationship between Canada and Latin America, especially with Colombia, and the role of the Canadian state in supporting business abroad. Before I hand the floor to Professor Tijerina, I would like to invite Councillor Davis to share a few words. This is particularly fitting because Colombia and Canada has maintained diplomatic relations since 1950, formally established in 1953, and as we'll hear, our commercial ties go back even further. Councillor Davis, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Thank you, Fairman, and thank you, Professor. I'm really looking forward to the professor's talk. I just want to thank the University of Rosario for this opportunity to address the assembled group and to say, as the commercial counselor here, our job every day is to build relationships through commerce. And I'm not a professor, but in my own view, I feel like commerce has often driven relations between countries going back to, and throughout history. So I'm interested to hear what's to come. I will say that I think it's a great time, and thank you for having the space for a conversation about Canada's commercial relationship with Colombia. I think it's a time in the world where it's for Canada to have an increased profile in Colombia. And I know that we're certainly looking forward to see what our countries can do together commercially to keep building this wonderful relationship that we have. I know that probably not not all of the content of the discussion we're about to hear is going to shine favorably on Canada, but I think Canada is a country that's very open to self-reflection and learning from our history and our past, and it's certainly something that we collaborate with Colombia on, for example, when it comes to Indigenous issues and others. So let's all take this in and learn from it, and I'm glad that that Canada has this space and this profile for our commercial relationship. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Councillor Davis. For us, it's so important to have different points of view about the relationship between Canada and Latin America, and especially Colombia. Professor Tijerina offered us the possibility to think about business expansion in Latin America in a specific period of time, but I'm sure that his research findings are help us to understand what is going on in the current relationship between Canada and Latin America. So, Professor Tijerina, the floor is now yours.
Well, good afternoon. Herman, for inviting me to be part of this experience in your class and allowing me to bring my students. Consul Davis, welcome again, and it is a pleasure to meet you. And the same to the students at Universidad Rosario. I very much look forward to listening to your questions and be able to address anything that that is illuminated in this session today. And of course, I hope one day to be able to visit the Universidad Rosario campus and be able to be there in the beautiful Bogota, which I miss a lot. That's where I was born, and of course it's in my blood, and I pretty much reminisce being there now that I'm here with Ferdinand. So I am. Let me tell you how I got to write and become a historian of Canadian business, and particularly Canada's role in Latin America. I grew up, as I was telling Federman, in Bogota for a little while. My dad was from Texas, and he worked for a cotton company. And as an American in Bogota, I had a free ride to go to the American school called Colegio Nueva Granada, and I was in that school for most of my elementary and middle school years. And it was during that time that I realized that instead of having American colleagues, I mostly had Canadian colleagues, students that whose parents were living in Colombia at the time. I'm talking about the 1970s and into the 80s, more the 80s. And I became perhaps curious later in life when I started a banking career and worked for banks and worked for multinational companies, that I realized that there was quite a big presence of Canadian interests in Colombia. And after a long career in banking, I went back to study my PhD here at UMaine, and it was through the Canadian American Center here at UMaine, which is supported by the Canadian Embassy in the United States. I dug deep into the intellectual part of discovering, okay, so what is the role of Canada in Colombia, and what is the role of Canada in Latin America? And that led me to my book called Opportunism and Goodwill, Canadian Business Expansion in Colombia, 1867 to 1979. And I hope that down the road, I'm able to write the second part of it, which is, well, the 1970s all the way into the free trade agreement of 2011, just sort of to capture that second chapter of Canada in Colombia, and of course, Canada in Latin America. So my thesis for this research was that there had to be more involvement in Colombia on behalf of Canada than sort of the early assumption that because Canadians and Colombians signed the diplomatic agreement in 1953, that's sort of where the story will begin. And And as I began to dig the primary sources, I realized that the story went way, way deeper into the 18th century and into the time of Confederation where Canada begins to form as a nation state. And so, first thing that I discovered, before Canada was a nation state, and it was part of the British colony in North America, Canadian ships, Canadian goods, like maple syrup, not like maple syrup, like lumber, another material for construction, was making itself into the Caribbean as part of the British Empire, and that at the same time, out of the Viceroyalty of Nueva Granada, where now Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, and now Panama exist as nation states. Back then, contraband would leave the ports of Cartagena and Barranquilla into Jamaica, where Jamaica became sort of an entrepot or like a middle ground space where then goods would be reshipped so that stuff from South America would end up in New England and British North America, and stuff that was coming from the Maritimes would end up in South America. And so it was this entrepot or linchpin that Jamaica played in the 1800s history of Latin American trade. Even while there was a Spanish Empire present, there was a British Empire present in the Caribbean, and there was a British Empire present in North America. And then when independence begins to take shape in the United States, of course, Canadian British interests settled into what we now know as Canada, the Maritime provinces of Canada. And the history takes a very different shape, a less informal contraband shape. And out of Confederation in 1867, the Canadian government officially says that that they would be extremely interested in of course, exporting and expanding trade relationships in the Caribbean and in South America as part of their early developments of an exporting economy. And I'll just have to quickly clarify that Canada at this moment and into the present time continues to depend heavily on exports. As it has a very limited and small consumer market today of 35 or 36 million people. I don't know exactly what the number is, but I know that back in the day, if it's still small, like small enough that it could fit the population of Canada into Mexico City, that's a small population that demanded that Canadian goods were exported outside of the Canadian economy. Early on in that early stage of nation building with Confederation, it was very clear that the founding fathers of Canada were very, very well connected, and in some instances were part of the economic sector of British North America / Canada. So we're talking about a business class that also becomes a political class, and because the two function is played by one person or one group of individuals, then clearly Canada's economic development and nation building process it begins from the beginning to be intertwined with Canadian business interests. And I know that Professor Federman has researched this in the more contemporary times about Canadian foreign policy in Latin America and questioning that humanitarian agenda versus the more economic agenda. And so what prevails was what has weight. The historical evidence led me to argue that from the beginning of of the development of the Canadian nation state, business played a tremendous role into how Canada would shape its foreign policy and how Canada would connect with the world. So, having said that, we are in the late 1800s, late 19th century, and Canada has opted to continue heavily invested with their intimate connection with the British Empire. And at that point in time, and into World War I, and into the interwar period between World War I and World War II, Canada will play a British card. So they will be very much in favor of connecting their economic development agenda to the interests of the British Empire. So to make the story short, and they betted that the British Empire would continue to be a dominant empire, and therefore their nation building project would be tied to the British Empire. And that seemed to be the way that these early relations of Canada and Latin America developed. So taking advantage of British presence in the Caribbean, taking advantage of British control of a region here in this Western Hemisphere, allowed Canada to piggyback on the British presence, and therefore it was not surprising that in Panama, in Jamaica, in the general Caribbean region, you would find Canadian business people traveling with British business interests, and also mingling with American business interests in the region. But they were mostly tied and connected to the British Empire and the British influence. Actually, when Canada first sends officials to begin to carve out potential opportunities for Canadian businesses in South America, Central America, etc., they will send representatives that were tied to Canadian businesses, but also would serve the service of an attaché or some sort of a representative for trade and commerce that would allow them to make bridges between the South American region and Canada. And this would be sort of the strategy during the late 1800s, early 1900s. And parallel to this, as you know, the United States is gaining a lot of strength and support in the Western Hemisphere. It's beginning to implement policies of manifest destiny, the Monroe Doctrine, basically arguing that there was no need for European presence in the Western Hemisphere and that European interest should leave. This led Canada to sort of begin to deal with the idea of what would happen if American interest in the region would overcome British interests in the region. But we're talking about World War I, the interwar period, so the first half of the 20th century, and Canada continues to bet on the fact that the British Empire will prevail. But while this is taking place, Canadian banks that begin to settle in the Caribbean, particularly in Jamaica, like Bank of Montreal or the Royal Bank of Canada, and insurance companies like Sun Life Insurance, which they have a branch here in Portland, Maine. If you go to the old port area, you will find Sun Life Insurance there. In Colombia, of course, Canadian banking presence is quite prevalent if you went there, particularly with Scotia Bank, which is the contemporary version of the old banks that were initially operating in the region. And Jamaica became sort of the semi-headquarters for their operations as they begin to explore the South American market. But they were very timid in entering the South American market because the presence of Britain in South America was limited to Brazil, to a certain extent Uruguay, and to Argentina. And so those were initially the first sort of points of interest of Canadian businesses. And then, of course, this will follow that down the road when they begin to open up embassies in South America. These are the first countries, together with Mexico, that will have a Canadian embassy and begin to have diplomatic exchange. Happens later for Colombia, simply because Colombia did not have that foundational presence of British interests in that particular country. So these banks that I just told you about and these insurance companies that I was just telling you about begin to explore South America by sending insurance and banking reps into the port of Barranquilla, which is one of the main ports in the Colombian Caribbean. And it is through that port that Canadian banks begin to plant a seed. And I argue in my book that Canadian banks sort of plant the seed because in order to expand internationally, nations use banks as a stepping stone so that when their other companies from other sectors come in, their companies will have a reliable bank to funnel their money back to their country. So in other words, you need Canadian banks to settle in the region so that when Canadian companies enter the region, they could then send those profits out of the region and into the Canadian economy. And of course, you can imagine that it would be less favorable if you had to use an American bank, or you had to use a British bank, or you use a French bank, or whatever it is, when you could use your own banks, because the banks would create leverage. And the insurance companies existed for the main reason of providing their services to Canadian workers that went down to the region, exposing themselves to quote unquote the dangers of the Caribbean and the dangers of these very uncivilized parts of the world. So insurance companies accompany their foreign workers, and also insurance companies at the same time could provide services to other foreigners that were in the region, talking about British foreigners or American foreigners that were also part of the early explorations of the Latin American markets. One of the first explorations that took place was, of course, oil. And at that point in time, Canadian oil companies like Imperial Petroleum had explored for Canadian oil, but they have not been able to find great deposits of Canadian oil in their territory. But American companies and British companies had found rich accumulations of underneath raw material in the soil of Mexico, Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, etc., and therefore became extremely interested in perhaps tapping those other resources and collaborate with the Americans to help explore, since the Canadian market counted with a very sophisticated know-how of mining exploration technology. And of course, this perhaps is not very relevant, but today, Canada controls more than 50% of mining operations in the Western Hemisphere. And of course, this is the result of their know-how from the past 100 and so years. So they didn't become a very powerful mining country in Latin America, Central America, simply from one day to the next. They have been working on this for about a century. And now, of course, they are sort of collecting the fruit of planting that seed back in the early 1900s. And oil, of course, was in its early birth. The Mexican Revolution in 1910 had interrupted the international system's ability to control Mexican oil, and therefore South American oil became extremely important because although the United States was tapping its oil, Canada could not have it, was not able to tap that oil yet. It will happen later with the tar sands and, of course, a lot of their oil operations that now are in place. Another parenthesis, up to today, Canada is still the number one provider of oil to the US economy. So again, things did not just happen from one day to the next. This took a whole 20th century to set itself up. So Canadians cannot extract their oil, but they have industry capabilities, know-how. Americans have controlled their oil, but they're more interested in tapping others' oils to control the broader supply of oil in the Western Hemisphere, possibly the policy of I first use other people's material before I deplete my own oil reserves, and therefore it was important to go to the other parts of the Western Hemisphere. And one of those countries was Colombia. And at that point in time, Colombia was not very welcoming to the United States because in 1903, Colombia had intervened on behalf of the Panamanians who were part of Colombia at that time, and sort of motivated them to claim independence from Colombia. And the US was willing to back this initiative as long as they could get the Panama Canal into their hands. So, of course, Canada was taken away from Colombia. Panama was taken away from Colombia. Panama gains independence, and in Colombia there's a rise of anti-Americanism. And if Americans wanted to explore and extract and begin to develop oil in Colombia, they were not welcome because they just took a chunk of the country away from Colombia, and therefore they were not welcome in any way or form. But the Canadian oil companies that were not able to tap had been absorbed by American oil companies. And the American oil companies cut a deal with the Canadian oil companies that they had absorbed and told them, you help us explore oil in a country like Colombia as a subsidiary, and we will give you leverage to bring your own personnel, to bring your own engineers, to bring your own equipment, and to also extract that oil and bring it back into the Canadian economy so that this oil can fuel the Canadian economy. And of course, it also opened the door for other Canadian companies to also win bids in order to build the pipeline infrastructure from the oil findings to the ports so that oil could then be shipped to Canada. So the next chapter in my book talks about how oil begins to develop in Colombia through a Canadian subsidiary. The name of the company, which then becomes the stellar and dominant oil company in Colombia, was La Troco, or La Tropical Oil Company. And of course, it was strategic to call it Tropical Oil Company instead of calling it Imperial Oil or Canadian Oil or something related to North America in one way or another. The naming of companies becomes strategic in the sense to fabricate locality and hide the foreign exposure of the company. That becomes, of course, part of the strategy. So between 1918 and 1945, between Tropical Oil and Andean National Corporation, the pipeline company, they basically developed the whole oil infrastructure of Colombia. At that point in time, when you begin to see cars, transportation systems utilizing and depending on oil, the fueling stations that you will see across Colombia were Esso fueling stations. And if you still drive to Canada today and you go from Montreal to Toronto,
Y esto, vaya, va con esto para entonces para desbaratar todos estos
Jorge, can you turn off your microphone? Okay, go ahead, Professor. Sorry.
no worries. So even if you go today to Canada, you see Esso fueling stations all across Canada, because that's what Canada implanted in Colombia. Today, those Esso stations are much harder to find. Now you will see a lot of Petrobras stations, which are the Brazilian oil companies that now have established themselves very strongly in Colombia as one of their key markets. But anyways, up to that first half of the 20th century, oil becomes Canadian in Colombia. And this will be sort of the status quo. And a lot of the oil that will fuel Montreal's economic development and Canada's economic development will be from Colombian oil. And up to World War II, this was the case. This relationship will end for two reasons. One, in 1950, the Canadian subsidiary of Standard Oil New Jersey that I was telling you about had signed a contract with the Colombian government to give back the company in 1950. And so one of the reasons why Canada's connection to oil stopped there for a while was because the contract went back to Colombia. And second, as World War II started and Germans sent U-boats into the Caribbean to sink strategic vessels from North America, the United States and Canada, then Canadian cargo ships, oil tankers, could not protect ships coming from Venezuela, from Colombia, going into North America. They chose to just cover and protect the Venezuelan route. So Venezuela to Canada and the United States began to control the corridor of Colombia to North America. But that meant that that oil no longer went to Canada, but it went to the United States instead. And so between World War II and the end of the contract, the end of that chapter of oil in Colombia ends. So we have now covered banking, insurance, oil. Another parallel presence of Canadian operations in Colombia was mining, and particularly gold mining. And of course, you now know the price of gold today is extremely high as a result of the volatility of the market. But back in the day, when Canadian companies begin to explore gold in Colombia, of course, the price of oil was also critically high in response to the volatility of the market back then. Now, how did Canadian mining companies enter Colombia? Well, through British mining interests. So mining in the Antioquia region of Colombia, where mining takes place, was controlled by British interests. These British interests begin to dissipate as the market changes. Some go out of business, others are bought by foreign interests. Some of these foreign interests are Canadian companies that buy interest in Colombian mining. American companies also buy interest in Colombian mining. And by the 1930s and 40s, you have Canadian mining, British mining, American mining for gold in Colombia at the time when the country begins to open its doors to industrial mining, open pit mining operations. So this mining relationship in Colombia under the belt of Canada happens through subsidiaries that are strategically created or built by either the American companies or the British companies that need to play a strategic card in controlling the market and controlling the mining zone And so building companies, dismantling companies, building new ones, destroying old ones becomes the strategy. And out of that readjustment of the mining sector comes the presence of Canadian mining. And Canadian mining, of course, like I told you at the beginning, now is a very important part of Latin American history. And there's a lot of advocacy against Canadian mines because of violations of human rights and other issues that have unfolded as a result of that mining boom. But in this particular moment in time, in this particular historic moment, mining had none of those connotations. It was not subject to social justice or human rights or anything of this sort. It was a very ugly mining operation, to say the least, environmentally and humanitarian wise. But that's not necessarily part of the story. The story is just to highlight that Canadian mining of gold in Colombia and later on of emeralds and later on of other precious metals becomes a key important aspect of Canada's relation in Colombia. So before you have diplomatic relations between Canada and Colombia in 1953, you already have mining operations, you have oil drilling operations, you have a pipeline infrastructure operations, and you have banking and insurance operations. So you have quite an array of presence of Canada in this particular country. And I'm just giving you one lens. If you went to Argentina, Mexico, the Dominican Republic, you choose the place in the map, you would begin to hear a very similar story about Canadian subsidiaries or Canadian direct companies present in these parts of the world. I'm just giving you the micro lens of Colombia and Canada. Now, the mining operations at the end, by the 1960s, ceased to be controlled by Canadian companies for almost 3 decades. The 70s, the 80s, and into the 90s, those begin to be controlled by American companies, and we begin to see the end of Canadian presence in mining. So what I determined is that there are these ebb and flows of Canadian presence. There are moments where they capitalize on the opportunity and they're present. And then there are moments where either British interest or American interest came to play and the opportunity was lost. And then a new moment in history arrived and Canadian companies would appear again. And then the opportunity would cease to be there and then the Canadian presence would disappear. While this is taking place, Canada also becomes involved in multiple other aspects of Colombia. There is a chapter in my book about Canada Air, manufacturer of commercial and military jet fighters and passenger planes, begins to flirt at the possibility of sending to countries, in this case Colombia, military weapons to fight communism in the region. Of course, you probably know that this was an American or US dominant sector, and we don't hear much about Canadian presence of military weapon sales in Latin America because it was mostly occupied by US interests. But in the case of Canada Air, in the 1950s, in the middle of the bubbling of the Cold War and in the middle of the effervescence of revolution in Colombia, where communism and leftist guerrillas begin to really put a challenge to the Colombian government, Canada Air finds an opportunity. That's why my book is called Opportunism, because the opportunity landed on them to sell to the Colombian Air Force 6 military jet fighters. And in my chapter, I just quickly described how the Canadian government did not want to sell military jet fighters to Colombia because they felt that it was a negative PR that Canada became involved in sales of military weapons when they were offering to the public a discourse that Canada was more of a peaceable partner and not an aggressor. And so they didn't want to paint themselves to the world as somebody that would be doing the job that the Americans did, which was to inundate the region with weapons. But at the same time, in the primary source, I discovered that the business sector really tells the Canadian government that they have to basically give a green light to Canadian industries to sell weapons in Latin America, because it would be strategically important for these companies to have an outlet to get rid of inventory, obsolete military inventory that was no longer useful, that was outdated, and it needed a new home in countries that did not need up to par military technology, but needed some sort of technology. And coincidentally, there was a military coup in Colombia under Rojas Pinilla, and this military leader was interested in using jet fighters to bombard civilians, leftist guerrilla civilians. And Canada becomes the country that provides this solution, including in the primary source, indicating that although the jet fighters have been used in combat in the Korean War, they potentially would be very excellent at fighting guerrilla forces in the jungles of Colombia as well. And so those jet fighters arrive. Canada Air finds a way to get rid of inventory and at the same time place a presence in the Colombian market. They will capitalize on building the towers, the telecommunication systems, the maintenance of the Air Force jet fighters, the training to the pilots, the updated technology. And so there were multiple secondary markets that became part of the Canadian opportunity when it came to jet fighters. And another sector that I wanted to perhaps highlight before my time is up was the development of other solutions, including Canada being the first country to provide Colombia with the issuance of citizen ID cards. So I know that here in Maine and in the US, we're debating whether we should have the, what is that driver's license that now you have to, the real ID, correct? And many people oppose the real ID because they find that it's infringing in their civil rights, because you don't need to have an ID to show people who you are. Well, in Colombia, you have to show an ID, carry an ID all the time. And this culture of carrying an ID and building an ID was a Canadian business solution. And of course, Canadians don't carry IDs, and Americans are arguing against the IDs. But a country in the developing world where you could issue an ID as a way to control and sort of supervise and sort of have some sort of account, some sort of, I would say, supervision over your population through the issuance of IDs for everybody, became a solution that was genially packaged by the Canadian private sector to provide the Colombian citizens with this culture of the ID. And today, that culture of the ID is prevalent, and they have gone through multiple IDs over the last 7 decades, and it, of course, is a money-making machine. And the same thing with passports, but Canadians don't make Colombian passports, but that's become a multi-million-dollar operation as well. So I conclude my book by indicating that then, finally, toward the 1950s, toward the 1960s, with the administration of Pierre Trudeau, which was the father of Justin Trudeau, he is elected in Canada with the idea of a third option policy, that Canada should not bend over and backwards for the US, that Canada should not bend over and backwards for the United Kingdom, that Canada needed an independent foreign policy that would look after its own self-interest. And with that idea, it is the Justin Trudeau, the Pierre Trudeau administration that then goes into the Latin American and into the African continent and into the Southeast Asian part of the world to spread the word of Canada in a more aggressive way. And of course, in the case of Colombia, the voice takes the shape of official development aid. So official development aid, which is what Trump just took all the money out of in the case of the US, in the case of Canada, became an important instrument to open doors to Canadian businesses. So aluminum companies entered the Colombian market through aid policies. Other agricultural companies have entered the market through aid policies. And so it opened the door to many opportunities, also for intellectual exchange, for the ability of Colombians to study in Canada, for the ability for research and development to take place between the two countries. Another way to lynch in and connect the two countries through official development aid. And of course, that lasted into the 80s when Trudeau's era ends, and then Canada, US, and Canada-Colombian relations take a very different shape. I'll end with this, during that 1950s to probably the last 6 months, and you know why I say the 6 months, up to the last 6 months, Canada had opted to tie a knot with the US, abandoning the sort of the umbilical cord that they had with the British. They built one with the United States, and it's the 50s up to last 6 months that Canada and the United States became cooperative partners in Latin America. So any move that Canada did was on behalf, in a certain way, to help the US facilitate its initiatives in the region. And at the same time, when Canada could do it, it would facilitate opportunities for US interests in the region. One of those cases is the 2011 Free Trade Agreement, which Colombia doesn't sign initially with the United States, but initially signs it with Canada, because again, there is this anti-American feeling and this sort of tension between the two countries. But once Canada signs the free trade agreement with Colombia, it's a no-brainer that they needed to sign it with the US, because at the end, the connection between the free trade agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico would intertwine with their relationships in South America. So it was a no-brainer that the two would connect. Today, of course, 6 months ago, with the presence of Trump policies, everything has been altered. Canada is once again, through Prime Minister Carney, launching an initiative to recoup their relationships in Latin America. Now that they know that, once again, as history has revealed, the US is not very welcome in the region as a result of its agenda toward the region, with the exception of Argentina and right-winger in Ecuador, right-wing government. There are not many other pockets that are welcoming Trump administration policies, and therefore Canada sees that as a new chapter, a new flow, a new moment where they can capitalize on. So the book just makes an argument that that is the case, that the presence has been vivid for a much longer time. I grew up with it. I saw my colleagues in high school being from Canada, not necessarily the US. My sister is married to a Canadian. My aunts are married to two Canadians, all which were part of the Canadian diplomatic arm in Colombia and ended up connecting in Colombia and now building a family over there. So even in that personal space, there is this Canadian-Colombian connection unfolding. And then my little cousins are Colombian Canadians, to make it even more intimate, of course, right? So there is a connection. And I argue that to look at the Latin American relations to North America from the lens of the US is only seeing a part of it, and that you need to see the Canada side in order to get the full picture. If not, you're just getting a part of the picture. That is sort of my argument. And I'll end it there and listen to questions. Is that okay, Fernando?
Yes, perfect. But first, I would like to frame the discussion and this conversation, because we are talking with students of comparative politics, international relations, and North American studies. And this research, I say, it's so important for us because allow us to to establish the connection between trade and foreign policy. I think this connection must be understood appropriately, not only with an historical lens, but also with a contemporary point of view. And of course, here, this research allows us to address the relationship between Canada and Latin America. I must confess that I found your book very fascinating. There's several research findings which are so interesting. For instance, it's so interesting to discover the early formal contacts between the maritime provinces, the Caribbean and South American nations. Of course, the discourse during the Cold War and the way Canada take advantage of American grand strategy throughout Latin America, preserving business interests. It's so intriguing as well, and of course the emergence of the promotional state. So here we have a terrific research, and I have a question for you, but in many ways you already respond to this, but I would like to ask the question in order to frame the discussion, because your research is about a specific time between the Confederation, 1867, and the end of the Trudeau era, right? And here there is an intriguing finding. The Canada's business sector was the driving force behind the bilateral relationship. And in many ways, we can learn about this period to think of the current relationship. And my question is, to what extent can your analysis of this business expansion in a specific business period help us inform Colombia's and Canada's choices today? Because today we are living in a different world. We are talking about a global, polycentric, and highly interconnected system, but your research allow us to think about the present and the future.
I think that as a globalization unfolded in the 1990s, I think that for Colombians, the lens of Canada became amplified. I think that it's at that moment of the expansion of globalization that Colombians, particularly younger generations of Colombians, begin to see Canada as an alternative option to the United States. Businesses in Colombia also begin to see Canada as an alternative to the United States. Tourism becomes an alternative to the United States as well. So Canadians begin to look north beyond Colombians begin to look north beyond the United States. And of course, the North American Free Trade Agreement also brings more agency to the image of Canada in Latin America, simply because the way that the things are produced and the trade of movement back and forth of goods and services and commodities. For example, this is the period of time where really Colombian coffee really begins to strengthen its positioning in the Canadian market. There is a lot of diplomatic exchange between Canada and Colombia in other areas beyond business. The humanitarian agenda begins to take place. Research and development in multiple fields begin to take place. And then Canadians begin to also distinguish Colombia separately from other Latin American and Caribbean countries, as well, because they are also educated in the fact that Colombia is no longer just a narco economy, but that Colombia is also many different things. And in those many different things, for example, it makes me think of a company called Farmaciel that now owns like 1 million hectares in Colombia to produce medical marijuana. And so marijuana, which was illegal and part of the drug war, suddenly after the legalization federally in Canada, becomes an important bilateral commodity to trade between the two countries. And so marijuana becomes a Canada-Colombia connection. And this company is producing the product in Colombia and then shipping it all to Canada in order to compete against Canadian manufacturers that don't have a 4-year growing season and that have to pay high cost of electricity and all kinds of extra business costs. And here you have a multinational already setting themselves up for a different business. And Colombia and Canadian travel through airlines extended its routes. So now there are charters, for example, of Canadians that can go to San Andres, an island that is owned by Colombia, but it's off the coast of Nicaragua. And you have direct charter flights that go to this island from Montreal and from Toronto, which is another Canada-Colombia connection that the Americans don't really enjoy or benefit much from because it is not part of their tourist radar. So those are some of the elements that I think, and there's so many students now from Colombia studying or working in Canada. I know there's a lot of postdocs that are working in Canada. Immigration also became a part of the conversation. There's a lot of Colombians that have migrated to Colombia. And of course, there's a lot of cyber nomads that have moved to Colombia, particularly to Medellin and to Cartagena from Canada, that now make Colombia their home. So the thing has changed quite a bit, where I would argue that we continue to be in some sort of infant stages of the relationship. The relationship is super rich and the surface has been tapped.
Thank you so much. I have a question for Counselor Davis. Is okay for you because the presentation is about the significance of the business sector. And here we have historical evidence that the business sector was the driving force behind the bilateral relation. And my question is, to what extent does this hypothesis, rooted, as mentioned, in a specific period of time, remain valid today?
I would say that commerce has been the driver of the bilateral relationship. As I mentioned off the top, I want to thank the professor for his intervention. Thank you very much. It's very interesting. I feel like the relationship is much more mature now. This is one of our biggest embassies in the entire Latin American region after Mexico. In fact, it is the largest. We have cooperation in defense, in policing. We have a bilateral cooperation program, which I think the professor touched on, that led to this. So I would say that the relationship is much more diverse and mature, but I think commerce is always going to be at or near the center of any bilateral relationship because it's often where mutual interest lies. So I'll take advantage to point out that Canada is one of the countries with which Colombia has a trade surplus. There was some news out yesterday that Colombia's trade deficit is at an all-time high, but Colombia has really benefited from trade with Canada, and I think the FTA is the free trade agreement is a great example of a real win-win. And I'll also take advantage to highlight that I think over the last several decades, Canada has really progressed a lot in sectors like mining and energy to ensure that it is employing the most responsible business conduct practices around the world, not only environmentally, but socially as well. So I feel like Canada is very well positioned right now to be a partner of choice for commercial relationships for Colombia. I don't know if I've answered your question.
No, for sure, because we're talking about really diverse bilateral relationship. And in the very beginning, if we are able to link Professor Tijerina's research and the current bilateral relationship, we can argue that the relationship was promoted by business interests, but in a certain point, several dimensions were included in this bilateral relation, especially during the Cold War. And after, in the early post-Cold War, we can observe a really diverse relationship. And actually, one of the most interesting milestones in the relationship is the free trade agreement, right, between Canada and Colombia. So I open the conversation for questions from the students. There a question in the chat: to what extent is bilateral trade between Canada and Colombia sensitive to the narcotics agenda? I think this is a question about security, but I don't know if Professor Tijerina wants to address this question, because your research was about business history, but this is a question about security and defense. But I don't know if you want to address this topic.
I would say I would like to address it. It is quite sensitive. I think that coincidentally, something we don't think a lot about is that the United States is the biggest supplier of cocaine to Canada, because all the cocaine arrives, the majority of cocaine arrives into the US, and then it's shipped into Canadian urban centers through the borders, and not necessarily through any other form, through airplane, but through actually cutting through our borders with between Maine and Canada. You find the link between Colombia, US, and Canada as a dynamic of narcotics trafficking. And of course, Canada has been heavily invested in fighting the war on drugs, but it is fighting it with the terms of the United States, because the USA is the one that pioneered the war on drugs, so facilitates the exercise of the United States, but doesn't necessarily have an autonomous approach toward the issue. That's where I see it. But it's a very delicate thing, and it is part of the diplomatic relations, of course.
For sure. Anna?
Hello, thank you so much for these interesting insights so far. I was wondering, because you wrote about how Canada helped the Colombian economy to develop, and I was wondering, to what extent do you think that external aid of a country can be beneficial to another country like Colombia, and if there may be also downsides?
Well, clearly, aid has played a tremendous role in the bilateral relation, and aid, although it facilitates win-win situations at some point, aid also sort of dictates the relationship. And one of the reasons why Colombia has hydropower and its energy is so dependent on hydroelectricity has to do with Canadian influence, because aid came through for the development of the electrical grid infrastructure of Colombia, and eventually it was not a Colombian decision to turn the country into hydrodependency. It was more of a Canadian / Japanese / American initiative to turn Colombia into a hydro-dependent country, which it's super good when there's rain, but it's not super good when there is no rain, because then the electrical power fails and then you don't have electricity. Aid definitely helped research and development, but aid also turned Colombia into monoculture operations. CIAT, which is a research center in Cali, was initially funded with the support of Canadian official development aid in combination with US aid as well. Aid has also allowed Colombian students to go to study at universities in Canada, and of course that's been beneficial to Colombian students, of course. Aid has its plus and minuses. That would be my position. I think when you depend so heavily on foreign aid, then you lose your sovereignty and you lose your capabilities of making your own decisions. It was an easy sale. It was a low-hanging fruit, and the low-hanging fruit is always super tempting.
Thank you so much.
I just want to add to respond Anna's question, based on Professor Tijerina's research, because when we analyze the relationship between Canada and Colombia, this research introduced a macro level analysis, which means that we need to consider that the relationship was beneficial for both countries and especially was essential for nation building. For instance, in the case of Canada, the promotion of a trade policy or trade ties in the region was essential because Canada was dependent on an export system. But in the case of Colombia, it was critical as well because the development itself was affected by Canada. So, in historical terms, here we are arguing that there was a win-win relationship. And I have another question for Professor Tijerina, especially because your research ends by the end of Pierre Trudeau era, and in many ways, Pierre Trudeau's resignation was a byproduct of the end of a global trend. After Pierre Trudeau, we are talking about the emergence of neoliberalism. And this global trend have an impact, for instance, in France. President Mitterrand have to introduce a sense of austerity in the budget. Brian Mulroney come to the power in Canada. Ronald Reagan in the US. So we are talking about the end of a global trend with the emergence of neoliberalism. So, in many ways, I would like to know if those global trends have an impact on trade foreign policy in Canada, because with every global trend, there are different understanding of the state, society, and so on, because the promotional state was based on a specific conception of the state and economic policy, but after we are going to introduce another understanding of the state and economic policy. I don't know if these global trends have an impact on trade policies.
Well, the first one is that, of course, the evolution of the relationship to culminate in the free trade agreement. Part of neoliberalism was to move away from tariffs and toward free trade. And of course, in 2011, the two countries agreed on a free trade agreement. That's part of the culmination of neoliberal objectives, privatization of public services. I don't know exactly how the combination of the bilateral relation has operated there. Deregulation has been a factor, of course, because the reason why Canadian mines leave Canada to mine in other parts of the world, in this case Colombia, is because Colombia deregulates its mining operations, so that you can basically practice open pit mining, displace indigenous populations from mining regions, use the state and the state's force to facilitate the business operations at the mining zone. And those are all factors of deregulation that allowed foreign companies, in this case Canadian companies, to capitalize on a very deregulated nation. And of course, the different governments of Colombia throughout the 2000s, from Samper onward, have all been administrations that have deregulated policies as a means to attract foreign direct investment. And foreign direct investment has absolutely boomed. And Dr. Davis even said that Canada and Colombia have the second biggest partnership in South and Central America. And that, of course, is part of that neoliberal outlet that facilitated the outcome of this reality. On the other hand, it makes me reflect here on Maine as well, simply because one of the two companies that control our electrical grid is a Canadian company. And our electricity comes from Hydro-Quebec, which is obviously in Quebec. And the fact that Maine depends on Hydro-Quebec and NMAX from Calgary means that even in Maine, deregulation has shaped our electrical grid. Imagine what it has done in a country like Latin America, which is like 50 times more deregulated than a state within the United States. So I would say that it accelerated the process of bilateral relations. It really provided an opportunity for the private sector on both sides to really execute their business strategies, something that they had not been able to do before because of state control, regulation, labor unions, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Tijerina. This is the end of our conversation. I would like to thank Counselor Davis and Professor Tijerina, and of course, thank all of you for joining us. And I hope you enjoyed today's session, and I would like forward to see you in our upcoming talks. Remember, this is the speaker series. What can the international relations field teach us about the contemporary world? Today we talk about business history, but this research is relevant for international affairs as well. Thank you so much and have a good day.
Thank you, Eric.